Is his beak gleaming? I don't know, something. AORUS. I did the Stargate joke already where the Setish guard's nose dripped. It's fine. This motherboard, should you buy it? I don't know. Let's take a look. The AORUS Master. GIGABYTE has gone off the deep end in a good way. 14 phases of direct drive power, an actual real finned heatsink. We can dump hundreds of amps, north of 600 amps, into our plucky little AM4 processor. Things are getting really interesting with AMD. If you've been living under a rock, there's the AMD Ryzen 3000 launch. We've got a whole bunch of other videos about that, and we talk about the different motherboards and challenges, things like that, to squeeze as much performance as possible out of those CPUs. If you have not checked those out, you should definitely check those out because there's a lot of good and valuable information in those that I'm not going to rehash here because it applies pretty universally to all of X570 and Ryzen 3000. The situation with this motherboard is that it's awesome. If you're thinking about buying this motherboard and you want more information, it's a top shelf motherboard. This is kind of the middle of the road for the top shelf. There's actually a higher end board, the AORUS Extreme, that's 10 gigabit. This one comes with 2.5 gigabit. The more expensive one also does not have a fan. So with PCI Express 4, it's quite a bit more heat generation. All the motherboards, all X570 motherboards, pretty much have a fan, except for GIGABYTE, except for the AORUS Extreme. They figured it out. They figured out how to do that. And they figured it out by basically turning the entire motherboard into a heatsink. So yeah, good job. This thing also supports 3 PCI Express 4 M.2s. 2 go through the chipset, which is also a PCI Express by 4 interface, so that's not really going to bottleneck. I mean, if you get 3 M.2s in a system, that's pushing the bandwidth that's available, plus your GPU connection. But you could run 2 M.2s through CPU lanes at by 8 and run your graphics card at by 8. That would also be acceptable. Because there are not really any PCI Express 4 peripherals other than graphics cards that can really use that much bandwidth. If you get a bunch of PCI Express 3 M.2s, you're not really going to saturate. Like 2 of the fastest Samsung PCI Express 3 NVMEs just barely is going to be close to saturating that PCI Express 4 link from the chipset to the CPU. So this is a much better situation than on competing platforms. It's actually kind of jaw-dropping how good this is in terms of a layout and an upgrade path and some other things. But with PCI Express 4, there is a little bit more heat production, a little bit more heat production on your CPU, so on and so forth. Also tested was the 5700 XT and the GIGABYTE 2080 Ti. The GIGABYTE 2080 Ti is something that I picked up a long time ago, so, exciting times. Also in this Fractal Meshify C case with the Celsius S24 all-in-one cooler. Now, Ryzen 3000 might have been called Ryzen 3000 Puzzle Box Edition because the initial launch actually was very smooth overall. There are some nits to be picked, however, and most of the nits to be picked are around voltage defaults and frequency defaults and clocks and fabric speed and power management and those kinds of things. And the AIB partners are they want to add their own special flavor to a board, and then AMD has their recommendations. Ryzen 3000 is even more temperamental than any past generation of Ryzen when it comes to voltages and the voltage frequency curve and heat production and managing the heat and a whole bunch of other things. And currently, I think, not sure, PBO and like the Precision Boost 2, we've got a really awesome video with Robert Halleck, and he's talking about, it's like, if you've got a big beefy cooler, you've got this extra 200 megahertz of headroom, maybe, depending on silicon and a whole bunch of other factors. I haven't really had 25 megahertz of extra stability, and it's not because the silicon doesn't have it. At this point, I'm like 7 or 9 different CPUs in, and manual overclocks are doing it for me better than Precision Boost 2, and I'm not sure why. GIGABYTE has a new BIOS layout. They're coming out of the dark ages with their BIOS, their UEFI, their interface, and things are getting better. There are still some rough edges, but things are getting better. The VRM situation on this motherboard is probably the best X570 VRM implementation that there is. Is it massive overkill? If you're not going to overclock, do you need this? No, absolutely not. But if you want a motherboard with a VRM that's going to be here after the heat death of the universe, this is your motherboard. I don't know what more there is to say about that. If you want the most up-to-date information on this board, there's a link to the forum thread in the description. You should go to Level1Techs, find the motherboard. Let's talk about it in the forum, because there's details that you don't have. Let's talk about the rear I/O. First off, this motherboard is the poster child for what you need at the rear I/O of the motherboard. There are 4 USB 2 ports, and there are 4 3.1, that's 10 gigabit USB 3 ports. So you get 4 10 gig ports, one of which is a Type C, so it's reversible and all that good stuff. And you've also got some more USB 3 ports, including a USB 3 BIOS flashback port. Those are 5 gigabit. You've also got your wireless connection, CMOS clear button, and a BIOS flash button. Don't accidentally hit the BIOS flash button. But you can flash the BIOS on this motherboard without a CPU, which is great for future upgradability and longevity. At the rear for networking, you've also got the Intel NIC, Intel Gigabit NIC, and a Realtek 2.5 gigabit NIC, although it is very difficult to find 2.5 gigabit switches. Quantia, what are you doing? Get those switches out. We need those switches. I digress. We've also got a really awesome ALC1220AB based audio codec implementation that's using the ESS Sabre DACs. So you've got a pretty high-end audio solution. It does have optical SPDIF out. You might struggle a little bit with the Realtek 1220 audio codec because there's so many different implementations of the 1220 audio codec. You really have to dot your I's and cross your T's with the settings of that. I use the audio interface through the monitor connection, like through the DisplayPort connection, so I don't that's not really an issue for me. I tested this with headphones, just plugging in the headphones and beeps and clicks and watching YouTube videos, and it was fine, but there may be other issues. The Wi-Fi here is the Intel Wi-Fi 6, so you've got the bleedingest edge, Bluetooth 5, awesome Wi-Fi solution. Now in the box, you do have a proper Wi-Fi antenna. It's not the little rubber duck antennas, it's actually a physically movable antenna. Also in the box, you've got a plurality of SATA cables, extension cables for both the digital and 50/50 RGB headers, and 2 analog temperature probes with really long wires. Fan profiles, the thing doesn't even run unless it's getting warm, and it'll slowly ramp the heat. You can control that through the UEFI. It shows up just like another sys fan. If you're monitoring the temperatures on your own, or your case has particularly good airflow, you can control the fan speed based on temperature, which is pretty awesome. You've also got fan control of all of the other fan headers on this particular motherboard. The motherboard layout, well, we'll talk about the layout in a second, but the motherboard layout is pretty awesome. Do note that if you're a crazy person and you were going to buy an APU to run off of this motherboard, there's no video out, so don't do that. One other bonus feature is there is a Thunderbolt header connector. Now, some of the pre-release and press versions of the motherboard do not have the Thunderbolt header soldered in. Gonna be a different video on that later because I did Thunderbolt on Threadripper. 8 fan headers, count them, 8 fan headers. That's a lot of fan headers. Well, 7 fan headers plus the chipset fan, I guess. Those temperature probes that I was talking about, with the fan control software in the UEFI, you can also configure how you want the fans to behave based on those temperature probes. Tape one to your graphics card starts to get hot, no problem, ramp up some fans. And I'm gonna give you some hints. There's a link to a thread in the forum, which is tips and tricks for getting your AORUS master and getting the most performance out of it. So with the 3900X, we're not even talking about overclocking here. We're just talking about setting the XMP profile and setting some options in your UEFI. You can get a much higher performance out of your 3900X than I have seen from other boards. And this may be down to just tweaks, or this may just be down to certain kinds of issues. On the Asus Crosshair Hero 8, for example, the voltages are insanely high right now, and it really causes a lot of performance problems for the CPU. And so I'm sure that they're going to fix that because the hardware is pretty solid. But it's like you start to run it and it's like, wow, my CPU is hitting 90 degrees C. Something is wrong, and that is the defaults on the motherboard. This motherboard doesn't have those issues. It works a lot better, but you can tweak a few things and get that much more performance out of it. The 3900X should be peaking at around 4.6 gigahertz, give or take, single thread, lightly threaded stuff. You get 2 6-core chiplets with that CPU. This motherboard is the motherboard that we did all of our initial testing with, and the 3900X, with those settings, you will see around a 4.3 gigahertz all-core Well, okay, that's actually technically an overclock, but with the overclock on the 3900X, you will see a 4.3 gigahertz all-core performance out of it that's pretty stable, and about a 4.4 to 4.5 single thread, which is pretty good. 4.5 on up to about 4 threads, give or take. Maybe 45, 50 on a few things. Didn't really see 4.6 pretty much ever, but that is far and away like the best scores ever, and some of the best scores like on Geekbench. We also tested this board with the 3800X, and the pattern was repeated there. 3800X is a single chiplet, 8 cores, 105 watts. Again, no real overclocking. Some of the best Geekbench scores for a 3800X that there is on Geekbench. So again, motherboard of the VRM situation here after the heat death of the universe, the motherboard is going to outlive your CPU. It is. It really is. This is an exceptionally well-built motherboard. I mean, there's a lot of other technical details like low-loss PCBs and a lot of other stuff that goes into like the manufacturing of it and how much copper is used, and signal loss, and the testing that's done to ensure low signal loss. Some people are like, we can run PCI Express 4 on the older generation motherboards. Only if your time is not valuable, because it'll work on one board but not on another board, and the old PCI Express 4 on older boards, you shouldn't, like, it'll cause gray hair prematurely. But overall, very impressed with this motherboard. I'm very impressed with what Gigabyte is doing with their UEFI. The only complaint really I have about their UEFI is that the same option is in a bunch of different places. Like, for example, memory gear down mode, it's in memory settings and AMD overclocking and like AMD CBS. And it's fine that it's in all those places. That may actually make sense because somebody would go into memory settings and be like, where's gear down mode? Or maybe in AMD overclocking, it's like, it would be convenient if this is all in one place. But if you change it in one place, it does not change it in all of the other places. There are a few things like that other than gear down mode. But in terms of like last generation UEFI, or even like 2 generations ago, it is very good that Gigabyte is investing in their UEFI and things to make it easier. So IOMMU groups and Linux support is basically pretty good out of the box. IOMMU groups are such that any of your PCI Express 4 peripherals off the chipset are in their own IOMMU group. Anything that's built into the chipset other than PCI Express, like your USB and SATA interfaces that are off of the chipset, that's all grouped in one IOMMU group, which is perhaps the only sad and disappointing thing. Anything off of the CPU is of course in its own IOMMU group, depending on what version of the Agiza that you're running, but as of this video, F5E is in good shape as far as your IOMMU groups go. So Linux support, basically there. Motherboard's solid. I love it. It's good. This is Wendell. Wait, no. I'm Wendell. This is Level 1. If you pick up this motherboard and you want to show off your build, come to the forums at Level 1. I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.